Okay, so have you ever wondered what fascism really is? Beyond all the heated headlines and the political sound bites we hear constantly. Today, we're taking a deep dive. We're looking into some truly fascinating, maybe challenging historical analysis from Leon Trotsky. I mean, this is someone who witnessed and actively fought against the rise of fascism in real time.
Yeah, and what's really insightful here, I think, is that we're trying to move past just simple definitions. We're digging into the actual mechanics, how these movements grab power, what conditions let them thrive, and really crucially, what strategies were actually proposed back then to combat them.
Right. And for this exploration, our source material is drawn from excerpts of Leon Trotsky's Fascism, What It Is and How to Fight It. It's this powerful collection of his writings, mostly from the 1930s, right up until his death in 1940. It was first published in 1944. So our mission today is pretty clear. Let's pull out the most important insights from Trotsky's analysis. We want to understand his specific definition of fascism, the conditions that let it win, and the concrete ideas he had for fighting it. The goal is so you can be genuinely well-informed on what is, let's face it, a critical and often misunderstood topic. Okay, let's start with the absolute basics then. Given how casually, how easily the term fascism gets thrown around today, what exactly is it, according to Trotsky? What's his analysis say about its core nature?
That's really the vital starting point, isn't it? Trotsky defines it as a spontaneous movement of large masses. So it's got this kind of grassroots energy, Plitvian in origin, meaning it comes from the common people.
Yeah.
But, and this is critical, it's directed and financed by big capitalist powers. He really emphasizes that its initial base comes from the petty bourgeoisie. You know, your small business owners, professionals, farmers.
Right, the middle layers.
Exactly. And the slum proletariat, the poorest, most marginalized workers. And even, he says to a certain extent, from the wider working class itself. And the leaders, figures like Mussolini, who famously was a former socialist, they're described as self-made. They use what Trotsky calls socialist demagogy. That means populist promises, often misleading ones, that sound like they're for the common good but are used to build these mass movements. Now, it's absolutely essential, he argues, to distinguish this from other kinds of dictatorships.
Like what, for example?
Well, he contrasts it specifically with Primo de Rivera's dictatorship in Spain back in 1923 to 1930. Rivera was an aristocrat. He just used the existing state and military forces directly. That's fundamentally different from someone like Mussolini, who actually had this struggle to reconcile the old, established military with his brand new fascist militia. So for a truly accurate sort of scientific analysis, Trotsky insists you have to understand these different forms of authoritarian rule. They aren't all the same.
That distinction definitely seems important for understanding how these things actually function on the ground. And Trotsky's very clear about where fascism finds its real base. It's largely in that petty bourgeoisie, right? Whether in towns, cities, the peasantry. He saw that pattern in both Italy and Germany. He also mentions this new middle-class state functionaries, administrators, as another potential part of the base. So yeah, this isn't just some fringe thing. It's pulling from quite broad segments of society, which naturally leads to the next big question. If fascism is this mass movement, what allows it to actually win, to triumph?
Well, Trotsky argues that the moment comes, the turn of the fascist regime arrives, basically, when the usual ways a capitalist government keeps control just aren't working anymore. You know, the normal police, the military resources, even their parliamentary systems, when those things are no longer enough to keep society stable, in equilibrium.
So a moment of real crisis.
Exactly, a deep crisis. He sees fascism as an agency, a tool through which finance capital, the biggest players, activates the masses of the crazed petty bourgeoisie and the bands of declassed and demoralized lumpen proletariat. These are people, he says, driven to absolute desperation and frenzy by economic chaos, by feeling they've lost everything, that society has failed them.
And the outcome, if fascism wins?
It's dark. It's chilling, really. Trotsky explains that after victory, finance capital directly and immediately gathers into its hands, as in a vice of steel, all the organs and institutions of sovereignty. So what does that mean? It means crushing workers' organizations, reducing the whole working class to an amorphous state, basically, unorganized, atomized, and creating an administration that aggressively penetrates the masses to stop any independent organization or action by the workers. It's total control.
Wow. That image of finance capital as a vice of steel is...
Yeah,
it's pretty stark. To really get a handle on this, maybe we should look at a specific case. What about Mussolini's rise in Italy? How does Trotsky's framework help us understand what went wrong there?
Right. Italy's a key example for him. Trotsky explains that Italian fascism was, in his view, the immediate outgrowth of the betrayal by the reformists of the uprising of the Italian proletariat. See, in September 1920, there was this huge revolutionary surge. Workers actually seized factories, industries. It was effectively a kind of de facto workers' control.
A real challenge to the system.
A massive challenge. But the social democracy, that's the main party advocating for gradual democratic reform within capitalism, often tied to the unions. They got scared. They took fright. They pulled back. And this left the proletariat feeling abandoned right after they'd made these incredibly bold moves. This disruption, this betrayal, became the single most important factor, Trotsky argues, in fascism's incredibly rapid growth.
So instead of pushing forward,
the social democracy focused on pulling workers out of the fight. They hoped that being, docile would win over bourgeois public opinion against the fascists. They even pinned their hopes on help from the king.
seriously, the king.
Seriously. It actively held workers back from battling Mussolini's emerging gangs. And, well, it all failed. Spectacularly. The crown, the upper layers of the bourgeoisie, they ultimately threw their lot in with fascism. So when the Social Democrats finally, way too late, called for a general strike as this desperate last measure, it was a total fiasco. Trotsky uses this phrase. He said they had dampened the powder so long that it just wouldn't ignite anymore. The moment was lost.
And then fascism moved in.
Exactly. Fascism entrenched itself.
Yeah.
It was helped by what Trotsky calls a favorable economic conjuncture, basically an economic upswing after the Depression of 1921-22. Mussolini, using these onrushing forces of the petty bourgeoisie he'd whipped up, systematically crushed the retreating, demoralized proletariat. But he didn't stop there. Once he was in power, he bureaucratized his own party. He effectively strangled the very petty bourgeoisie that had carried him to power, integrating them into the structures of the bourgeois state.
Why do that?
Well, Trotsky suggests it was a calculated move. It was necessary because the masses he'd initially united were quickly getting disillusioned. They were becoming a potential danger to his newly consolidated power, so he had to bring them under tight control.
That's quite a detailed breakdown of the Italian situation. So if we zoom out again, what does this tell us about the bigger picture, about the roles of these different classes, the bourgeoisie, petty bourgeoisie, proletariat, when society hits a crisis point?
It really forces us to unpack those relationships, doesn't it? The bourgeoisie, the capitalists, the petty bourgeoisie, including peasants, and the proletariat, the working class. Trotsky outlines broadly 3 historical stages of capitalism based on how these relationships work. First, at the dawn of capitalism, the bourgeoisie used revolutionary methods. Think of things like Jacobinism during the French Revolution, which he identifies as a radical petty bourgeois force to fight feudalism, the monarchy, the church.
Using radical allies to win power.
Precisely. Then came the period of bloom and maturity. Here, the bourgeoisie preferred orderly, pacific, conservative, democratic forms. This includes reformist democracy, social democracy, which again Trotsky sees as fundamentally petty bourgeois currents. They managed to incorporate some workers through what he calls the labor aristocracy, higher paid, more secure workers. But then finally you get the decline of capitalism. In this stage, the bourgeoisie finds itself forced to resort to methods of civil war against the proletariat. And this is where fascism, another, but this time extremely reactionary petty bourgeois current, comes in. They need the support of the petty bourgeoisie to crush the workers because the old democratic methods aren't enough anymore.
That really underscores the tremendous, of what decisive importance, as he puts it, of these petty bourgeois masses. Their choices seem absolutely critical for the fate of bourgeois society. They're kind of the swing group.
That's a good way to put it. They are the swing group. But the relationship is deeply uncomfortable. The petty bourgeoisie often regards the bourgeoisie with envy and often with hatred. They feel squeezed by big capital, yet the bourgeoisie themselves distrust the latter. They don't fully trust the petty bourgeoisie, even while desperately needing their support against the workers. Trotsky describes fascism here as a, quote, caricature of Jacobinism, but for this stage of decline. And he's very clear. The big bourgeoisie likes fascism as little as a man with aching molars likes to have his teeth pulled. They turn to it out of desperation, as a last resort, when they feel threatened by the proletariat.
Okay, so if they rely on them so much, is the petty bourgeoisie just stuck? Are they condemned to remain a tool in the hands of capital forever? Or is there another possibility?
Not necessarily, according to Trotsky. He directly challenges that idea. He states that the alliance of the petty bourgeoisie and the big bourgeoisie is not indissoluble. It can be broken. Since the petty bourgeoisie is, in his analysis, fundamentally incapable of an independent policy, meaning they can't lead society on their own, they ultimately have to choose. They have to align either with the bourgeoisie or with the proletariat.
So there's a potential alternative alliance.
Yes. In conditions of capitalist disintegration, deep crisis, the petty bourgeoisie can link its fate with the proletariat. But, and this is a huge but for that to happen, the proletariat has to inspire confidence. It has to show strength by the firmness of its actions, by a skillful offensive against the enemy, by the success of its revolutionary policy." End quote. But Trotsky warns, if the Revolutionary Party, the organized leadership of the working class, if it vacillates, becomes confused, contradicts itself, then the petty bourgeoisie will lose faith. They'll end up blaming the workers for their own misery. And that's exactly the moment when a party like National Socialism, the Nazis, appears. A party that can channel all that hatred and despair against the proletariat.
This raises a really important question then. If these conditions, these class dynamics, are so clear in hindsight, why did it all go so terribly wrong in places like Germany? Why did fascism manage to seize power there?
Yeah, Trotsky meticulously analyzes what he called the fascist danger looming in Germany, especially looking at the September 1930 election results. He points to the absolutely gigantic growth of National Socialism, the Nazi Party, that went from 800,000 votes to 6,400,000 votes.
A huge jump.
Massive. And it completely dwarfed the Communist Party's own gain, which was about 1.3 million votes. For Trotsky, this showed the petty bourgeoisie swinging decisively towards extreme imperialist reaction and, crucially, pulling considerable sections of the proletariat along with them. And why did this happen? He argues it was primarily due to the lack of a revolutionary party that could offer a credible fighting alternative. Fascism, he concludes starkly, is the party of counter-revolutionary despair.
And what about the established parties, the Social Democrats, for instance?
Well, the social democracy in Germany, the main reformist party, made absolutely fatal errors. Tragically, they just repeated the mistakes of the Italian reformists. They saw fascism as just a temporary thing, a post-war psychosis or a crisis psychosis. They completely missed, Trotsky argues, its organic character as a mass movement growing out of the deep collapse of capitalism. They clung to the existing state apparatus. They were crying, "Help! Hindenburg! Exert pressure!" relying on the Prussian police.
Relying on the state to save them from a movement the state might actually end up enabling.
Exactly. Trotsky ridicules this. He points out bluntly that the worker who becomes a policeman in the service of the capitalist state is a bourgeois cop, not a worker. He calls the reformist leaders inept boobs for relying on a government and a police force that had, historically, fought against revolutionary workers far more often than they'd fought the Nazis.
A fatal miscalculation.
Yeah.
And the Communist Party. Did they fare any better in his analysis?
Tragically, no. The German Communist Party, he writes, also learned little from the Italian experience. Their view is that fascism is nothing else but capitalist reaction. They believe that the differences between diverse types of capitalist reaction are meaningless. This oversimplified view, what Trotsky termed vulgar radicalism, meant they completely missed fascism's unique nature as a mass movement, fueled by the petty bourgeoisie. And this misunderstanding, he argued, paralyzed their ability to fight it effectively.
And wasn't there also this issue with the Comintern's policy?
Yes, a huge issue, a pernicious influence, Trotsky called it, was the Comintern's theory, the Communist International, directed from Moscow, the theory of social fascism. This theory controversially declared that the Social Democrats, the reformists, were actually the chief enemy, just as dangerous or even more dangerous immediately than the actual fascists.
Calling fellow workers' parties the main enemy.
Exactly. This ideological stance led to, well, catastrophe. It isolated the communist vanguard from the broader working class, prevented any possibility of collaboration against the common enemy, and ultimately led to shipwreck. It was the complete opposite of what was needed, which Trotsky argued was a united front of the workers against fascism.
Okay, so if the existing parties, both reformist and communist, according to this analysis, made such critical missteps, what was the concrete, practical alternative? What did Trotsky propose for actually defending against fascism on the ground?
This is where he introduces the concept, the imperative, really, of the workers' militia. He saw this as absolutely crucial, a means to, quote, conserve and strengthen the instrument and the means of struggle organizations, the press, meetings, etc., basically to protect the workers' ability to organize and fight back. He warns forcefully against flabby pacifism and false hopes in the existing state or leaders. These attitudes, he said, are incredibly dangerous because they only embolden the fascists and destroy the confidence of the middle classes. the petty bourgeoisie and the working class's ability to actually protect society from chaos.
So organization for self-defense.
Yes, and while the United Front, a broad coalition of workers' parties, is important politically, he insists that ultimately only the struggle of the masses decides. And for that struggle to be effective, proletarian combat detachments must exist and be educated, trained, and armed. The militia is the core of that.
But the source material itself brings up a lot of common objections people had to this idea of a workers' militia at the time. Things like, well, some said, we just need mass self-defense, not a separate militia. Others claimed calling for a militia was just provocation, that it would just make things worse.
Yeah.
Then there was the argument that arming the workers is only okay in a revolutionary situation, which doesn't exist yet. And the painful reminder that, well, the militia didn't save the German proletariat from defeat. Or, even more ideologically, the argument that if we reply to fascist revolvers with our own revolvers, we're losing sight of the fact that fascism is just a product of the capitalist regime, and maybe the most practical one. Where are workers even going to get arms? The enemy has rifles, cannons, tanks, gas, airplanes. How does Trotsky respond to all that?
He takes them on one by one, systematically dismantling each argument. First, this idea that mass self-defense is enough without a militia. He counters that the militia is the organized vanguard of that self-defense. Without these organized combat detachments, even the most heroic masses will just be smashed. To argue against the militia, for him, is to deny the need for organized leadership within the struggle. Second, this provocation argument. He calls that a fundamentally reactionary argument. It's like liberalism saying the oppressed provoke the reactionaries simply by daring to struggle for their rights. This, he says dismissively, is the philosophy of Tolstoy and Gandhi, but never that of Marx and Lenin. It's a philosophy of passivity, of accepting victimhood.
In a timing argument, only arming in a revolutionary situation.
He finds that particularly absurd. This profound argument, he says sarcastically, means that the workers must permit themselves to be slaughtered until the situation becomes revolutionary. He argues forcefully that the old peaceful, normal, democratic situation has given way to a stormy, critical, and unstable situation. And this unstable situation can tip either way into revolution or counter-revolution. A revolutionary situation doesn't fall from the skies, he insists. It takes form with the active participation of the revolutionary class and his party. And that participation includes preparing for physical struggle before it's too late.
What about the German failure? The militia didn't stop Hitler?
His response is blunt. The German militia failed because of a worthless strategy. Specifically, that Stalinist social fascism policy, which tragically divided the working class and prevented a united defense. It wasn't the idea of the militia that failed, it was the political leadership. A correct policy is necessary, he stresses.
And the point about fascism being a product of capitalism, so fighting it physically misses the point.
He calls that viewpoint absurd. Following that logic, he says, means renouncing all struggle against any social evil because most are products of the system. How else, he asked, to check the armed offensive of the enemy, if not by an armed defense, in order, in our turn, to go over to the offensive? It's a practical necessity.
Okay, finally, the practical question. Where do the arms come from?
Here, Trotsky asserts the workers' advantages. They are more numerous, more determined, more devoted than the fascists when they are roused to struggle. He argues they can actually arm themselves at the expense of the fascists by systematically disarming them, seize their weapons in clashes. He even suggests this tactic could pressure the authorities who might fear workers getting armed into disarming the fascists themselves, just to prevent those weapons falling into proletarian hands. Ultimately, he concludes, the principal obstacle, one can say the only obstacle, to forming effective workers' militias has its roots in the skeptical and passive character of the leading organs of the workers' organizations. It's a failure of leadership, of will, of revolutionary perspective.
Not a lack of potential or means, but a lack of leadership.
Exactly. And he wraps up this whole powerful section by quoting Clausewitz on war and politics. Physical struggle is only another means of the political struggle. It is impermissible to oppose one to the other, since it is impossible to check at will the political struggle when it transforms itself, by force of inner necessity, into a physical struggle. The duty of a revolutionary party, therefore, is to foresee this transformation and prepare for it.
That's a profound and pretty radical statement about the nature of political struggle, isn't it? Taking this whole analysis now, if we connect it to the bigger picture, what does it suggest about the future of fascism, maybe even its potential in places like, say, the United States?
Well, Trotsky actually addresses the perspective in the United States directly in some of these writings. He notes that the perceived backwardness of the U.S. working class, politically speaking, is only a relative term. He acknowledges they are very combative. You see it in strikes, in labor actions throughout history, but they historically lacked what he called broad social thinking, a cohesive, class-conscious political ideology. He observes what he calls a historic law for fascism's conquest. It tends to succeed only in those countries where the conservative labor parties prevented the proletariat from utilizing the revolutionary situation and seizing power. He points to Germany's missed opportunities for proletarian revolution 1918-1923, arguably again in the early 30s, as key examples of this failure opening the door.
So failed revolutions paved the way.
That's his argument. He describes fascism as a specific link of a specific political cycle with distinct stages. It starts with a capitalist crisis, leading to working-class radicalization, then some initial sympathy from the petty bourgeoisie. This is followed by confusion among the big bourgeoisie, then, crucially, the exhaustion or defeat of the proletariat. That defeat leads to petty bourgeois despair, neurosis, and rising hostility towards the now defeated workers, all culminating in a fascist victory. It's a whole sequence.
And applying that sequence to the U.S. at the time he was writing.
He saw the U.S. then as being in the initial phases of radicalization, pointing to the rise of powerful new labor organizations like the CIO. He thought that while a major event like World War II might temporarily interrupt this process, it would ultimately give it a more tremendous tempo and swing afterward. This, he felt, would inevitably put the problem of forming an independent labor party, a mass party of the working class, squarely on the agenda in the U.S. He also makes an important distinction. Military dictatorship is bureaucratic, it relies on disorientation, and people can often rebel against it more easily. Fascist dictatorship, however, needs that mass base born out of desperation after the working class has already proven incapable of leading society out of the crisis.
Okay, so we've unpacked quite a lot here. Trotsky's specific definitions, the historical conditions he saw enabling fascism, the really tragic failures he identified, and his pretty radical proposals for resistance. Taking all of that together, what's the ultimate overarching takeaway for anyone listening who wants to understand how to prevent this kind of cycle from repeating?
Well, look, Trotsky's direct call, rooted in his specific ideology, was clear. Build the Revolutionary Party. For us today, perhaps looking back with a different lens, this might translate into a broader but still essential insight. The absolute critical importance of organized, proactive political action in challenging or preventing these kinds of extreme ideologies. It's about understanding, I think, that passive hope or just relying on existing institutions alone probably isn't enough when things get really critical. It underscores the need for strategic collective engagement, for building effective unified movements capable of offering a real alternative. As Trotsky himself put it, it's kind of unworthy to just sit back and speculate if success is even possible. He saw a favorable perspective that justified revolutionary activism. It is necessary, he wrote, to utilize the opportunities which are opening up and to build the Revolutionary Party. It's fundamentally a call to agency, right? To intentional action, rather than just resignation or despair.
And there we have it. That was a truly illuminating and I think quite challenging deep dive into Leon Trotsky's analysis of fascism. We've really tried to explore his precise definition, those critical conditions that allow it to rise, especially, as he saw it, the catastrophic failures of established political parties and those very radical, very concrete measures he proposed to fight it, like the workers' militia. It's definitely a vital historical perspective, even if a controversial one.
Yeah, and it really leaves us with an important question, doesn't it? If we understand, as Trotsky argued, that the historic function of fascism is to smash the working class, destroy its organizations, and stifle political liberties when the capitalists find themselves unable to govern and dominate with the help of democratic machinery, then what does it mean for you, listening now, to be truly well-informed and perhaps truly prepared in a world where these same historical forces might still be simmering, maybe adapting, maybe taking new forms just beneath the surface?
It's definitely a question worth reflecting on. Trotsky's insights, even though they come from another era and are deeply embedded in a specific political theory, they compel us, I think, to consider their implications for how we understand power, class, and resistance in our own time. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope you'll continue to explore complex topics like this with us.